everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, where you will learn why organizations should integrate process management into a management system to achieve sustained success. I've been watching the chat, and everybody has joined from all over the world, which is so cool to see. I'm excited to share a little bit about our speaker before we welcome him to the call. Colin Christmas currently works for Eagle Certification Group. He joined the group in 2019 and currently serves as the managing director, supporting Eagle's international growth. He's an experienced professional with 20 plus years in the food industry, where he worked for Nestle. Throughout the years, Colin has had the privilege to live and work in numerous countries around the world, which has helped develop an excellent understanding of process, systems, and standardization while working with different cultures. Colin, thanks for joining us today.
Maddie, thanks very much for the introduction, and thank you APQC for the invite to present today. I echo Maddie's comments. I'm looking at all the chat and everyone's from everywhere, which is great. We've got a little bit of a global audience today, and it's pretty much a global subject, process management. This is something that I've been very passionate about. I had the opportunity to work in business excellence roles for way over 10 years. And then I moved to a compliance role where I worked with management systems for over 10 years. So seeing both sides of the fence, I would describe it. So that's been very important to me, and I gained a lot of insight there of how these different teams work, and some work closely together and some not, and there's some good reasons for that as well. So with that, I'm going to kick off, and I want to start from the beginning. I have an analogy that I use a lot is I plant seeds. So what you're going to get from today's webinar, hopefully there'll be a few seeds. It's not going to be groundbreaking stuff, but what I'm doing is planting seeds that could grow within your organization and make your organization stronger. Planting seeds in terms of your educational background that may interest you to go and learn more about a topic that I'm going to talk about today. And so that's the philosophy. And starting from the beginning, I kind of will apologize in advance, but for any process historians out there, we're going to start from the beginning in terms of a little bit of a history lesson, just to kind of set the scene. So when we talk about process approach, we talk about process management, business process modeling. You know, we had TQM in the 1950s to the 1980s. That was kind of the beginning of the journey with actually understanding processes, and actually organizations then starting to ignore functional or department boundaries. That really kicked in the 1990s. It was very common. There's a whole craze that kicked off about business process re-engineering. And I was around at that time, and that was kind of my educational background and moving into the workplace for the first time. Being a process analyst, I had to learn a lot about what organizations were trying to do. They were trying to define their processes and re-engineer their processes to make them better. Emphasis here on ignores the department functional boundaries, because I'm putting emphasis on it because even today, I am seeing organizations that still very much think in a functional silo, and there's opportunity there with those organizations. So functional boundaries, it's a very simple diagram here that will explain that processes go across functional boundaries. And it's really important for process owners to understand what boundaries that they're crossing, and to understand who their peers are, and ultimately whether their outputs are received correctly as an input into the next function. And that's really, there's a lot of emphasis there I put on customer satisfaction, internal customer satisfaction. And there's a whole philosophy around that as well. When you understand your processes and your boundaries, is what are you passing over to the next function that they have to receive a quality output from you to make sure that the process continues in a robust and efficient way. So when you look at this presentation, I hope you get access to the slides, because I put a lot of hyperlinks in here. And the reason I'm trying to do that is I believe we've probably got a mixed audience today. We've got some people that are process engineers or process improvers, and we've probably got some systems managers that's working with management systems. So I've tried to blend the two together And what I'm trying to do here is try and give you the official definition from ISO. So a process is an interrelated, interacting activities that use inputs to deliver an intended result, which is effectively the output. So a lot of process engineers don't see ISO as a reference, and a lot of systems managers do. So that's where I'm trying to connect the dots for you guys. And then another ISO definition is once you have your processes for a management system, you have to identify your processes. That's mandatory. And essentially they have to be measured and they have to be improved. So that's, it sounds pretty basic, but you'll be surprised. There's a lot of processes that are not measured appropriately and a lot of processes that don't demonstrate improvement. And somehow they manage to survive without the scrutiny of the organization and maybe without the scrutiny of oversight as well. So these are the two key words: measured, improved. The processes are interact. So they're constantly interacting and they've got to deliver consistent results. And it's cross-functional boundaries. That's another key word is if you work in a function, I really encourage are we connecting the dots cross-functionally? Do you have, not everyone has to do that, but do you have a star player in your team that likes to connect the dots? And ultimately that person needs to be encouraged to be able to meet with the other departments, understand what's going on, and provide more of a holistic insight to the overall process itself. The other key thing is processes can be critical. Some processes are not. So you have a tendency, or organizations can have a tendency to treat processes equally. And ultimately that's a waste of resource. You could be spending on a process that's not that important to the organization. What are your key strategic drivers? This comes back to your objectives. We'll touch upon that a little bit later on in my presentation today. As I mentioned before, interrelated activities, inputs and outputs. I do apologize, it's probably a history lesson and you guys probably know this already. But again, I just want to put it from an ISO perspective that this is the ISO interpretation. Inputs, outputs, how do you monitor, measure? And then you have to look at the efficiency. The efficiency, results achieved versus resources used. That's super important. You may achieve the result, but it may be intense on resources. The effectiveness, the ability to achieve the desired result. Are we delivering against our objectives? Simple thing that you can do at year end is to say, did we really meet our objectives? If you're not meeting your objectives, your processes might not be efficient and your management system may not be providing the robust, might not be the robust tool to deliver against those objectives as well. Okay, so with that, I want to make sure you're all alert. I know it's the lunch hour and you're probably sitting there eating a sandwich at your desk, and I want to keep you on your toes if you're in this part of the world. Here's my poll question. So in your organization, are compliance, so the people that's working on management systems managers, are they linked to business excellence or process management? So is your organization working as a combined team or function, or are these positions separate in your organization, or don't you know? Would love to have you provide some input on that. I'm trying to see if there's organizations that's working together or have separated these tasks. I am being told that I can't vote, but if you've voted now, I'd be very interested in seeing the result. So no, it's pretty much what I expected. This is very common. There are some organizations that's linked it together, but the majority keep these as separate teams. Now that's okay, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, but there's opportunities there to have a very close relationship between the two. But it's very common. So if you're one of the organizations in the middle, that's okay. If you're one of them at the top, then that's the kind of organization that I want to work for. So with this, as I say, I've got a mixed audience. So I'm talking to management systems owners right now. If you are a systems manager, if you're a quality systems manager, occupational health and safety systems manager, environmental systems manager, if you know the details of what your function is all about, whether it's quality, whether it's food safety, environmental safety, occupational safety, but if you don't know process mapping or think in a process-based way, you're in the wrong job. And I have to be very blunt about that, because I really want to get you thinking, and this is me planting the seeds to make sure that this is really important for you to start learning or connecting the dots and getting very close to the process improvers in your organization. So this is my philosophy with a systems manager. As I mentioned before, right at the top, process thinking. This is why I'm on this webinar today talking to you guys. There's some links here. There's process. There's a good blog from APQC. Take a look at that. Our systems managers really understanding their processes, because you may know your subject matter. You may be a subject matter expert within your function, but ultimately systems is going to require a different skill set. So sometimes the subject matter expert is told that they have to be the systems manager, and they will execute sometimes in a prescriptive way and sometimes not fully understanding how processes work or why they're critical. That leads me on to critical thinking. So critical thinking is, once you look at understand something in a systematic way, you have to be very critical, understanding lots of different things. Systems thinking as well. You have to understand what are the unintended consequences when you're looking at inputs and outputs. Uniformity of output is key. Is that consistent through the organization? And then ultimately, I think we're only touching the tip of the iceberg with risk-based thinking. Management systems are pushing this more and more, but we still tend to do things without fully understanding the critical processes, as I've mentioned before, and fully understanding the risk and the consequences by not spending the right amount of time on something that's critical for your system, for your management system. So where are we going with this? We've talked a little bit about management systems. Now, for the process guys in the webinar today, let's talk a little bit more about what you're focused on. And I'm sure this is familiar territory for you, which is process frameworks. So basically, process frameworks, I love process frameworks, by the way. They're reference models. They are the how to execute something and how to copy and paste that throughout your organization. So essentially, they support the description, the assessment, the optimization of business processes. So already we can see we've got process owners that really are familiar with this concept of optimization process of business processes. And we've got systems managers that may be more subject matter experts looking at the requirements of a standard. So a really good diagram that I like, and my eyes lit up when I saw this for the first time, and I do repeat this in presentations. So if you've been to any of my presentations before, I apologize, but I want to re-emphasize this every time. This is a good model where you start looking at what are your processes, how do you sort them from a very high level corporate strategy and plan to the key policies that might be supporting a management system, for example, a quality policy. And then you have a lot of your processes, you have manuals, you have process maps. So this is the cross-functional stuff. And then you might get into level 4, which is your procedures. These may be typically functional, and these are the work instructions, workbooks. And then finally, you get down to level 5, which is your documents, your records, and reviews. I see a question that's popped up to say, is that macro processes from Jesus? Well, the macro processes, if you look on the right-hand side, really the policy and the businesses, the business strategy are your high-level processes. You can argue that some of your level 3 processes are macro processes as well, because they could be regarded as process maps and end-to-ends, and we'll get onto that. And then you've got the detailed processes that sit below that, and that's typically going to be sitting with some of the process owners in their functions as well. So you go right from the top of the leadership, what is the why of the organization, right through to the what and the how. So I saw another question that's coming up to say, is that related to the process control framework, the PCF? Well, you've just stolen my thunder, because that's my next slide. So the key thing is here is the macro processes come first within an organization. Lucky enough, I was on a global project that started, I'm getting old now, that started 21 years ago. with Nestle, where the organization launched on a business excellence initiative and started mapping macro processes across an organization that's basically in every single country around the world. So it's quite fascinating to be part of that macro process mapping. So that journey started there, and ultimately, when you get once you've mapped these key process steps, and then they are carried out by each function department, it's then possible to contrast the result with a complete reference model. So, and that's where the PCF comes in, the APQC process classification framework. You can see whether processes that are designed in your organization are sometimes appropriate or not. It's a good reference point to understand what is your industry sector, and the PCF model is by industry sector, or it can be generic, and you can see whether you have good alignment, and that's where the re-engineering piece is possible as well. And then process mapping and tools and techniques. So I'm going to go through some of these for you guys. I see a lot of questions coming through the chat. Just for context, I will have time at the end of the presentation to answer some of those questions for you. So, and if I don't get through all of them today, I'll make my best efforts to email with you with some answers as well. So the process mapping tools and techniques, I'll give you a sneak preview. This is nothing new and this is nothing groundbreaking, but my techniques hopefully might help plant a few seeds to say, you know, what have I learned over the years and what could be applied to your organization. So with that, we'll start with the end-to-end process maps. This is an example from APQC. So you may be very familiar with this if you're a process improver or a process manager. And I hope even the systems managers are understanding of this if they're in an organization. Most of these end-to-end process maps have been around, I don't know, these tools have been around for about 20 years. So not groundbreaking, but pretty much this is the macro processes. This is where you're starting off, idea to market, order to cash, market to order, and then understanding what are the processes, what are the steps. And this is also part of your value chain mapping as well. And then what are the support functions that are there to ensure the processes can operate effectively. So we have the end-to-ends, we have the swim lanes. I'm still a big fan of swim lanes. I often get in debates where people say that they've moved on from swim lanes. It can be a good way to very quickly visualize a process, and I'm still a big fan of that. You really start to see then that there's certain organizations that are functional thinking, and to a certain extent, big organizations will expect the people that work in those functions to stay in their lane as much as they will preach and talk about process and process mapping and end-to-ends. People are encouraged to stay in their function. So that's why not everyone within the function is going to be looking holistically, but you do need a few people that have that mindset and that ability to do that. It's up to you to identify who they are and allow them permission to connect the dots. And where appropriate, they are the ones that will engage in opportunities for value chain mapping, process improvement, and also supporting the management systems that the processes are going to overlap. So as an auditor should really be looking at these kind of processes as well, but really it's the organization's processes that's going to help them understand what they're doing and understand whether they have a robust process that ultimately delivers the right outcome. So they're the high-level processes. They're the macro process maps, swim lanes, end-to-ends, and so on. And then we get into the topic of process owner and ownership. And it's very interesting. Some organizations, process owners are clearly identified, and those processes clearly understand that they're a process owner. There are other organizations where it's not clearly identified, and the process owners are head of departments that have delegated or even abdicated responsibility for their processes, and they don't understand them. And sometimes the systems manager and the process improver is scrambling to really fully understand them and translate them. But my key piece of advice is the process owner must truly own their process. They must be really understanding of that. So what I would say is start by when you, as a systems manager, and I put my systems hat on, is you sit down with a process owner, and quite often these are quite senior people. They don't always think, as I mentioned before, in a systems way. They don't have process thinking. They're certainly good at risk mitigation and understanding risk. That's true. And they're very good at the critical thinking piece. But the process and the systems thinking is sometimes an education journey for them. So how do I start? I typically sit down and the process owner, a senior member of staff, will say, "Oh, okay, you're here to help with the quality management system." They're not that excited by you walking in the room. But you can flip that around, because I typically start with saying, "Hey, what's your biggest headache? What's your biggest problem that you have today? Tell me about that." And it could be a procurement director. And the procurement director may say, "You know what, Colin, my biggest problem is onboarding suppliers. It's taking too long." Well, that onboarding process is the first process step that's mapped. Okay. So I'm here to help you map the processes that's critical to you. You fix their biggest headache. If you work on it, what's in it for me, you're really going to get their buy-in. And if they see the results, and if by mapping that process, the inputs, the outputs, the resources, the policies, the procedures, the process maps that's all associated to that supplier onboarding process, and if the expected outcome with the work of a systems manager that has oversight, with audits, with process improvers all working on that process that's critical to that process owner, then the process owner will be calling you, and you don't have to knock on their door and try and find time for them. That's the turning point. And that's the biggest compliment you can get, when they understand that you've basically helped their biggest headache. So the other thing is consistency. So really, as I said, you've got process mapping. I'll use the example of the procurement director. Supplier onboarding is taking too long. It's ineffective. So that would be the first process step. My key tip here is to make sure processes fit on one page. I've seen organizations where process mapping, they will have 25 processes mapped. And then they say, "Hey, I don't like management systems because they're too much work and I don't see the return on investment." Well, my answer to that is they're as much work as you want them to be. My tip is to say, make sure your processes fit on one page. People may have a different opinion, but ultimately you cannot manage 25 critical processes. Really, what are the top 4, what are the top 5 processes that you have to work on? And ultimately, are those processes aligned with the organization's strategic vision, the objectives of the business, and so on? And have they been cascaded down? And if they have, they should really be on your process map here. So that's kind of my tip. Make sure the processes fit on one page. And ultimately, when you start doing this, you start having aha moments with process owners, because they'll say, "Okay, this is my process. I use supplier onboarding again. You're receiving inputs from quality, because quality are doing a supplier audit. You're receiving inputs from your R&D, because they're doing the research to see if that product is viable into finally a finished product. You're receiving inputs from finance to see whether the cost analysis is going to work for that product," and so on. And then when you start speaking to the process owner, you'll say, "Okay, so that process has various inputs, and it relates to certain procedures, certain instructions, certain resources." And in a lot of cases, you are connecting the dots for them. And maybe they're not talking to all of those other process owners. And that triggers them to have conversations to say, "I've now got a holistic view of my particular process." So get everything on one page. Don't overdo it. The other key thing is why I talk about process ownership, and why I say the process owner must own the process. It's because it's leadership, systems managers, business excellence It's your job to ensure roles and responsibilities are appropriately allocated across the organization. This happens during process mapping, and this should be scrutinized as an ongoing process after your management system or processes are established. Super important, not always done. It's not always done by the most appropriate people. And you'll see organizations that will have processes allocated for accountability and responsible because it's always been done that way. And I've seen a lot of cases where quality managers, because maybe the clues in the title that they're a quality systems manager, ends up with some responsibility that they shouldn't, because these management systems are cross-functional. And this is where the processes and roles responsibilities come in. Give you a very quick example. In the UK, there was a train crash 2002 in Potters Bar. There was 7 people that died. There were 7 people that died. Now, where does that come back to in terms of process engineering, in terms of process mapping and management systems? Well, in this situation, there was an overall head of track safety and there was overall head of train safety. And I'll give you one guess what happened when there was a train crash. Those 2 heads of departments did this. Hey, it's not my fault, it's the problem with the train. Hey, it's not my fault, it's the problem with the track safety. So you are seeing a classic example when you are mapping roles and responsibilities, there was no overall accountability for safety. And that was found out in the inquiry after the event. So this is severe consequences. This is systems failure. This isn't, okay, the train was going through too fast. People might say, oh, they didn't maintain the track safety, or they moved the points on the tracks. I understand that these are all symptoms to a bigger problem of systems failure. And a lot of it often comes back to roles and responsibilities. If you see this in your organization, you need to say, where does the buck stop? And just a simple question like that may avert a systems failure in your organization. Then process owners, another tip. We've talked about inputs and outputs. Everyone knows that terminology. A fun example that I've seen that works quite effectively is get all of the process owners in the same room, get them talking together, and then say, okay, what are your outputs? And map them on a Post-it note. And then say, okay, now give your output to the person that's receiving that as an input. And it's quite fascinating. You get some aha moments. You think it's kind of a basic exercise. And then I see the finance guy saying, well, this is my monthly report. I need to give this to another process owner, the procurement manager. So he needs to understand his monthly spend for commodities. And then I say to the person receiving the input from the output, are you happy with that Post-it note? And typically you have a conversation. They might say, yeah, that's fine. Or you might say, well, no, not really, because I receive this financial report once a month. I really need it every week. Or I don't get the granularity I need. Or it comes on the first of the month and I need it on the last of the month because I have to report that to my technical manager. And you start having these aha moments that it's quite a simple thing with Post-it notes that ultimately that's the objective, and it comes back to uniformity of output. Simple exercise, can be fun. Typically, it's not easy to organize because the process owners are quite senior people, but it gets accountability, gets them really owning and understanding their processes. So Post-it notes, try it out if you haven't done it already. The next one, as I said, it's not groundbreaking. Turtle diagrams, they've been around for forever. A lot of organizations, this is more of the detailed level processes, the lower level processes. When we look at this, again, inputs and outputs, we're very familiar with this. The previous diagram I showed you was SIPOC. This is turtle diagram. So this is really for the process owners to do. I think we don't really need to talk any more about that, except that I'll give you a little bit of a story that in one of my roles, when I first moved to the US, I happened to have my desk right outside of my manager's office. And he was new to the function, new to the department. He was the overall head of a group of analytical labs. And every 5 minutes, he would come out of his office and say, hey, Colin, where's that report Where do I get the procedure for this? Where do the expenses go? What is doing this, right? And every day I'm getting these questions, and I was like, this is driving me crazy. So what did I do? I gave him this. I moved my total diagram to a mind map. So I put the link in there. APQC talk a lot about mind maps. And then with that, it's basically a lot of hyperlinks to the information that's related to the process. So with this, it's a one-pager. And if you're looking for training reports, if you're looking for policies, instructions, if you're looking for the KPIs, if you're looking for what's coming from head office, if you're trying to understand what are the objectives and the roadmaps and so on, you start mapping this in one place. The good thing about this is if a new manager comes in, you've got a one-pager. A one-pager, they pretty much go through all of these hyperlinks. It takes them, because this information is all in different places. It can be on an intranet, it can be on the cloud, it can be on a different platform, it can be on a SharePoint, it can be on the shared drive, you name it. But what you're doing is bringing all this information into a one-stop shop. And ultimately, that person can learn the process relatively quickly. And two, you don't have to go through all these different tools, logging on and so on. Hopefully, with certain hyperlinks, you can go directly to that information that you need. The final piece with this is it can be very useful during an audit process. If you're really confident about your process, and we've done an audit like this, every process owner walked into a room with the auditor for their interview, and they put their process map on the wall. And the auditor will say, okay, show me your technical assistance reports. Show me your, because you're really demonstrating that I got my process buttoned up here. I'm measuring it. I know what my plan, do, check, act is. I know what all my inputs and outputs are to make sure that my process is managed effectively. And the feedback we got from that audit was to say, hey, I've audited 60 sites in your organization, and this one is by far the most organized in terms of processes. So that's another way or a different idea of how to do process mapping in your organization. And then finally, with process owners, the key thing is consistency. So as I mentioned before, you might get a process owner that's mapping everything, all their SIPOC processes on one page. But then you go to someone else in the organization and they've got 25 processes. And then you've got someone else that wants to use total diagrams, and other people that want to do SIPOC diagrams, and other people that's not fully understanding that there's a linkage back to end-to-end diagrams. And some people not even have any process mapping at all. So the key thing is, once your organization has defined the principles, and that could be a SIPOC diagram, but 4 to 5 processes only, simple statements like that, and a lot of coaches about how to manage your processes, then you get consistency across the organization. Then it becomes seamless. And as I mentioned here is really then understanding the linkage. The people working in functions are going to be focused on SIPOC and total diagrams, but you need to understand they go back to the end-to-end diagrams in the swim lanes. When we look at objectives being cascaded down the organization, if you have an objective, and it may be that it could be, let me think of something, I don't know, reduce customer complaints related to certain defects. Well, that's going to touch so many different functions in your organization. It's going to touch different end-to-ends. But the cool thing is if that's the overall objective, to have, I don't know, a 10% defect consumer complaint reduction, how do you thread that all the way through from the end-to-ends? How do you put that in the swim lanes? How do you put that in your more detailed level processes? If you can thread that together at the beginning of the year, and then that becomes, your number one critical process, guess what? If everyone's pulling in the same direction across multiple functions, you've got a much more likelihood of achieving that objective. And that links back to your management system as well. So this is what I see a lot still today. This is why I want to put some emphasis on it. Going back to management systems owners, how does your management system look like? I sometimes refer this to a horse with blinkers on, and it's very functional siloed. So basically, This is how I manage my function. This is my vertical slice. I don't really care about management objectives because I've got some sort of technical goal to achieve. And it could be in food safety as well. I'm working on food safety. So everything else is not so important when actually it is. So management objectives are not fully understood. They're not linked. The management policy is not always linked to the objectives in the management system. That linkage is not coming. You have uniformity of routines. You have a lot of emphasis on conformance and compliance. Now, this is the optimal goal for a management system that really is looking at its processes correctly. As I mentioned before, you've got process maps like end-to-ends and swim lanes and SIPOC diagrams and turtle diagrams. And are they consistently, do you understand the linkage inputs and outputs in your organization? You see management objectives, they're cascaded down to all levels. The management policy is linked to the overall objectives that's coming out of the management system. Uniformity of output. This is all about expected outcomes. Are you achieving your expected outcomes? Is there consistency in your process? And it's not about the routine, it's about the output. The output is at the end of the end-to-end, it's really with the consumer, the customer. And then as a management system owner, you are programmed to a certain extent to make sure that that management system is ensuring conformance to the requirements of the standard and compliance against regulatory and statutory requirements. Well, that's just half the story, because a process-based system linkage with your process improvers is driving the continuous improvement. Your management system, if you get it right, and this is why it's important for process owners, you've got a tool in your organization that can really help with process improvement. And if you're not looking at it, that's the opportunity. Okay, so based on that, we have organizations typically will learn about process mapping while implementing their first management system. They may have already done that, and some organizations have done process mapping before the management systems came along, or they may have been done independently. But the key thing is that's when they really should come together. That's the first piece, the process mapping. And then the second piece is the organization is then going to learn more about techniques such as PDCA, the Plan, Do, Check, Act. That's the Deming cycle. And ultimately, this is there's a lot of dollars associated to this in your management system in terms of return on investment. And that's where the senior leadership will be very interested, for sure. So when you come back to PDCA questions for process owners, again, if a process owner really owns their process, they need to learn about process mapping. Start with a Post-it note exercise, but then they need to learn about PDCA. And if a process owner doesn't really fully understand PDCA, who I believe this is a great opportunity to help them. Thinking in a PDCA mindset is so valuable. So simple questions about the process, and if you're speaking to a process owner, how did you plan your process? You know, are your objectives truly linked to the management objectives? How did you agree on target setting? And is that a realistic goal? Does that align to your strategic initiatives? Are you measuring the right things? That's the plan piece. Second piece is the do. Is the process being carried out as planned? You know, what affects your ability to do that? These are the kind of questions that come out. This is the execution piece. Are you doing what you are saying you are doing? Very, very simple statement, but in a lot of cases, the answer is no. And then that's where what affects your ability to do that comes in. What is there resource constraints? What are the other things is there environmental constraints? What are the constraints that's preventing that? Are the inputs that you're receiving not at the expected level for you to be able to do your task? And then the other key point is the check. This is related to performance. So are your plan results for the process being achieved? How are you doing? And again, are we measuring the right things? That's the plan. And if we are, is that driving the right level of performance? That's really critical here. And then the final piece is the process achieving its expected outcomes, right? And the other key thing is you could say, yes, we're delivering a safe product, but is that really the expected outcome? if the outcome of the consumer is satisfaction and you're delivering a safe product, maybe if we put it in the context of food, yeah, it's safe food, but if the outcome is satisfaction, if it doesn't taste good, then you're not delivering what you need to be delivering. So these are the kind of tough questions that come out in organizations, and you'll be surprised. A lot of organizations are not doing the right thing. They're doing the right thing in terms of what the management system's been designed. But when you start looking at processes, you start really challenging the whole philosophy of what the system's intending to do, and ultimately understanding the expected outcome. With PDCA, again, I could do a whole presentation on this, but I won't. But there's a lot of PDCA auditing questions, so it's very similar. Take a look at that. There's a reference link to a paper from the Audit Practices Group. So depending on what you're looking at, but again, a very good way and some very good trigger questions, open questions, that's going to trigger a very good conversation with a process owner as well. So take a look at those. Deming, for a guy that you could say that he really understood how management needed to operate and how systems needed to play their part. The key thing is we need data. We cannot work instinctively in a process improvement world or a management system. It's not about our gut instinct. It's about data. We have to have data-driven decisions. Not management by numbers, but actually having data to help us make the right decisions. So what does that mean? So, if you're a systems manager and you're not working on process improvement, again, you're in the wrong job. I hate to say it, because if you just think you can tick off all the requirements in the standard in a prescriptive way and be a subject matter expert of the system you're managing, you're not doing the right job. You need to sit down with the process improvers and learn that other side of the coin. And this one brings me nicely into kind of things to wrap things up, that we had a poll question. It's very deliberate, and I got the answer I was looking for. Is systems managers that are working on conformance and compliance, there's often a disconnect with organizations such as Business Excellence with objectives that are process improvement. Why do I know there's a disconnect? Well, I spent 20 years on both, 10 years on one side of the fence and 10 years on the other. So I'm talking from my experience. That's quite normal within organizations. I think we saw over 60% people saying that their organizations are similar. There are some pioneering organizations that have linked those functions together, that the management system is really driving the process improvement. Now, that's a huge task. In a big organization, to try and bring those together, that's almost an impossible task. But what can you do, right? I'm talking to you now as systems managers, and I'm talking to you as business excellence or process improvers. Start having a conversation with your counterparts. Have a lunch and learn. Ask them to come in and teach you about their side of the fence. If you're designing an office space and you're a systems manager, make sure if it's an open planned office that you are sitting near the business excellence team. And make sure there's no walls dividing you, because simple things like that can really prevent these two things. These things need to be better connected. As I say, you're not going to have departments that's going to merge overnight. But look at the organizations that have. I've given you a case study link here to Tata Projects Limited. They integrated process frameworks with their certification standards. And again, these examples are few and far between, but I don't know, I haven't worked with these guys, but I've read the case study and I'm very impressed with it. These are the opportunities. I think these guys were very forward thinking to be able to break down those organizations and integrate them with overall accountability. That would be my recommendation to you. Have a look at that case study and look at ways to better interact between these two functions. There's more synergies there than you realize. And then the final thing I'd like to wrap up with before I take some questions is when you really get it right. As I mentioned here before, you start implementing a management system. And over time, you will get to a system that is conforming to the requirements of the standard. You will be compliant to regulatory and statutory requirements. You can potentially get through an audit in that middle point here. And ultimately, some organizations stop there. They think they've done enough, and they may do a little bit on improvement just because the standard is asking for them. But you know what the opportunity is? The opportunity is this, is when you start linking your processes to your management system, when you start driving the efficiency and effectiveness in the process improvement. I try and look at organizations and I try and look for this S-curve. A lot of it is more of a U-curve, I would say, in a lot of organizations. That's normal, so don't beat yourself up, but understand that the process improvement, if it's linked to the management system, and if you get process thinkers, systems thinkers, really driving what are the risks, what are the unintended consequences, the outcomes could be avoiding a train crash. The outcome could be avoiding a food safety recall. These are big things that human lives are at stake here, right? So that's what it's all about. And this is what drives me and my passion for linking the management systems to the process improvement, because ultimately there can be a lot of at stake with the expected outcomes and systems failure if it goes wrong. So last but not least, APQC have a lot of further reading on this. So take a look at this. There's a lot of content in there. Some of it is member-only content. So I encourage you to look at understanding a little bit more about APQC if you haven't. I really think what these guys are doing is excellent. And I think the fact that they're connecting the dots between integrating process frameworks and certification standards is really, really important. And that's why I value the presentation and doing the webinar with you guys today. So with that, I think we have about 10 minutes for some questions. And I thank you for your time today.
Thanks, Colin. We have had quite a few questions come in, and I think you mentioned earlier, so I just wanted to remind everybody on the call that if you have extra questions that we didn't get to, then we will be able to follow up with answers to those after the webinar. So one question that came in is, do you have any names of companies, or I know some of that might be confidential, but maybe a case study we could send out or refer to of anyone who has successfully linked the systems manager's objectives and the business excellence objectives?
Yes, I can just go back to the slide here. Is this one at the bottom of this slide? It's a case study from APQC, and it's Tata Projects Limited. So that is one example where I've seen an organization that they have that as one single department. Their management systems are linked to their business excellence and process improvement.
All right, thank you. And you'll see the link in the slide deck, and everybody will get a copy of that in a few days. So don't worry there. You mentioned that some processes are critical to the organization and some are not. What would be your advice on determining which processes are critical to the organization?
It's a good question. What I tend to look at is a lot of organizations will have a strategic roadmap, or they will have a strategic plan. And each year, a lot of heads of department will list their focus areas. So it depends. There's going to be different words for that. It could be must-win battles. I think there's lots of different ways. But understand what's really important at the top of the organization. So ultimately, what part do you play to support a huge, project? So if the head of the organization, the must-win battle is to reduce goods inwards, so ingredient packaging costs, and let's say that there's association to that, you can simply look at it and say, well, that's a procurement's job. Well, no, you may need to switch suppliers. You may need to onboard new suppliers. So that's where there's lots of new inputs. So quality will have to audit new suppliers. Finance will have to do new cost forecasting. R&D will need to go out and find out, if there's suitable ingredients to be changed. So that's just one piece. And then ultimately, how, there could be input to the manufacturing processes, the logistics process, and so on. That's where I would say that's a key objective. What processes need to change within your organization to meet that objective? And ultimately, is everyone pulling in the same direction? Imagine if procurement have to have reduced 10, 20% of a commodity cost, and then the quality department says, oh, we don't have time to audit the new suppliers. Right, and this is the problem. The other thing is, when you look at it a systematic way, you might say, okay, let's chase after this 20% saving, and procurement then want to chase after low-cost suppliers. What does low-cost suppliers bring? Probably more quality issues. So you've got to look for the unintended consequences that you might go with lower-cost suppliers, and then ultimately bring a problem in. You might reach your objective for 20% saving, but you might create a recall in the process that loses you that saving. So that's the dialogue, the discussion that's got to be had during that process. And ultimately, what I always say with those critical processes, and it's cross-functional, I've always had a philosophy: you have to hold hands. What does that mean? If you chase the 20% saving, and if procurement get their goal, but there's a recall, then you're holding hands. So that basically means that you have done this collectively. You don't say, hey, I've won my objective. I'm the procurement guy. I got my savings. Not my problem that the quality guy is dealing with all these crazy recalls. The concept is we're in it together. And ultimately, there has to be incentives, and there has to be acknowledgement that if you chase something and you accept the risk for pursuing a certain objective, that it's ultimately cross-functional. You all win together, or you all fail together. So I think that's important in organizations to understand that philosophy, holding hands.
I like that concept. So this is a little bit of a definition question. Someone said, I've been assuming that systems managers have been digital systems managers, but she doesn't think that's right, or he, I'm not sure who sent that, but talk a little bit more about maybe synonyms or other roles that would be a systems manager. How would you define that role?
Oh, okay. In my example, a lot of it goes back to the ISO definitions. So you see the definitions, management system standard. You might see that acronym MSS. So the management systems, if you look at ISO, they have various different requirement standards. So a quality management system, which is ISO 9001, an environmental management system, ISO 14001, an occupational health and safety management system, ISO 45001, energy management system, which is ISO 50001, food safety management system, ISO 22000, and asset management systems, and there's so many others as well, anti-bribery management systems and different things there. So these are the things that typically organizations will put in, and they'll typically will start with a quality management system, and they may add on additional management systems. So when I talk about a systems manager, it's really linking to a ISO management system that you would put into your organization and potentially integrate with other management systems as well.
Thanks. So there was one question, and I'm going to chime in with an answer, and then I'll let you build on it. So they're talking about category 13.0 in APQC's process classification framework, which is develop and manage business capabilities. And the question is, who is or are the process owners? And this kind of goes back to one of the questions earlier in the chat about process groups. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we did that here at APQC when we were working on our process documentation. Is we divided that category into the process groups. So manage KN, manage process management. And we defined an owner for each of those. And so we kind of bucketed out that category and assigned an owner based on either their strengths or the role they had that aligned with that, whatever skill set was needed to manage those process groups. And that's how we assigned the owners. We do have one executive sponsor over the entire category, but we broke it up into a little bit easier to manage bite-sized pieces. Colin, I didn't know if you had anything to add on to that.
Yeah, I would, when you're looking at that, if you understand the overall process, that roles and responsibilities, as I said, sometimes is who's the overall process owner. So track safety versus rail safety. Well, there isn't an overall accountability. So that process is an issue that needs to be escalated to leadership. Someone needs to allocate that. Leadership needs to take the ownership in terms of who that process owner should be. The good thing is that once organizations have done that, you can cross-reference it against the PCF and say, is it appropriate for a quality manager to own a certain task? One example being cost of non-quality. Cost of non-quality, well, quality is in the title, so let's let the global head of quality take care of that cost of non-quality. But then you start looking at well, what are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to do? And when you break down the process, you might find that the overall, or the 80% of the cost of non-quality is material variance. So it's then you say, well, material variance is shop floor, it's the manufacturing guys, it's the operations team. So when you go through a process and you start mapping the process, and then you understand what is the biggest contributor to that process that you want to improve, you start then saying, well, you know what, that process owner shouldn't be the head of quality, it should be the head of operations. And by the way, if you're not meeting your targets, that should be cascaded to make sure that that ownership is consistent across all of your organizations around the world. And if you all pull in the same direction, you can deliver the right savings because you've got the right person driving it, you've got the right accountability there. So that would be my advice with trying to allocate the right process owner, is give that to leadership, let them decide and cross-reference with PCF.
Like we have had a ton of questions, so I think we're definitely going to have to do a wrap-up article. There's one question that I think you already addressed, but I'm going to read it to you, and if you have anything else to add, we'll kind of end there. So the question is that process owners are typically within a specific function, and some processes are cross-functional, right? So the issue that they see is that the process owners just think about their box and their function, and they don't think about the next one. And I loved your analogy about holding hands, and I think that was a great way to answer this question, but I didn't know if you had anything else to build on here.
When you do simple exercises like the post-it note examples, and they realize that something that their function is providing isn't good enough, then they take the ownership to fix it. You are trying to help visualize them to connect the dots. One of the things that I really like is I've seen process mapping journeys starting 25 years ago. And at that time, it really was functional silos. And there was a lot of senior leadership that just couldn't think in a process way or think in a system way. What I encourage and what I'm seeing now is the younger generations are coming through with that process mindset. We're seeing a whole evolution of systems thinking as well. So if you've got up and coming people in your organization that are going to be your future leaders, these young guns that you're recruiting out of universities today, get them onto these type of projects, let them be a systems manager. Don't have your best subject matter expert running your system. Sometimes you'll say that subject matter expert is a great contributor to the system, but I'm going to put this 25-year-old kid onto and run the system. You know why? Because this guy is coming up the ranks, and once he's got understanding of processes, systems thinking, process mapping, and so on, he's going to be the leader that we're going to need in 15, 20 years time. So identify those kind of people, and the more senior leadership that get into those roles that get this stuff, which is management systems, which is APQC, all of the stuff, all the tools you've got, is that for me is the objective, that future leaders need to understand systems better, and that's happening, but the world's changing very quickly as well, so we really need to make sure that's part of their wheelhouse when they get to the higher levels of the organization.
I love that, the opportunity to grow your people where it makes sense and that'll give people a sense of ownership too. So I think that's a great way to put it. Again, thank you, Colin. We are out of time. Like I said, we'll follow up with the questions. There was some great chatter in the chat, and it was just so nice to have you on the webinar today, Colin, as well as everyone that listened. A couple of reminders as we close out the webinar: you will receive a copy of the slides and the recording via email in a few days. Don't forget to take our satisfaction survey that will pop up, and then be sure to register for upcoming webinars and view webinars on demand via apqc.org/events. And don't forget to connect with us on social media. Thank you everyone so much for joining today. Thanks again, Colin. I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you.